So, welcome again everybody to this webinar today about most efficient training programs and how to use metabolic data, how to use a metabolic profile or physiological profile of the athlete to create better training programs. We're going to start with looking at what is a physiological profile, what is a metabolic profile, and what data are we talking about here in the first place. For everybody of you who has attended the previous webinars, or everybody who's already a user of INSCYD, the next 10 minutes, approximately 15 minutes, will be something you've maybe already seen. So we're trying to, speed it up maybe a little bit, but also we have to take care of the people who've not seen that. So thanks for your patience. Maybe if you see some slides that you have already seen last week. Okay, so what do we mean when we talk about a physiological profile? Physiological profile is, so to speak, an avatar, a profile of an athlete which contains the most important physiological performance factors, which could be, for example, obviously a VO2 max, so the maximum aerobic power, people like to call it the capacity, it's a flux rate, so therefore it's more power. The glycolytic pressure, the VLA-max, anaerobic threshold, fat combustion rate, glycogen content, lactate accumulation rate, all these kind of metrics or parameters that influence performance in sports when it comes to the condition. So when it comes to short-term events like a few minutes or long-term events, obviously how important these metrics are changes. This is the type of the event. But this is what we mean when we say a complete physiological profile. Knowing all these data for your athlete, being able to capture all these data for your athlete. That's what physiological performance profile means for us here. In the reporting, this looks like, as an example like that, this is like the metabolic capacity, so the most important benchmarks you see here. Relative and total VO2 max, you see the VLA max, you see the power and anaerobic threshold, relative total as percentage of VO2 max. That's the stuff we're talking about. Another way to express this metabolic profile is what we call the fingerprint or the radar chart or spider chart, where you can see these metrics relative to a peer comparison group. So, for example, how high is the VLA-max? In this case, presented here, VLA-max is comparable high, VO2 max is quite a little bit lower. You can see that the dot is closer to the center of the radar chart. Body fat is rather high, utilization of VO2 max and anaerobic threshold is rather low. So that would be one example of how such a profile would look like. Okay. When it comes to training and using this information for training, we have to bring this data alive, so to speak. We have to look at what is actually going on in the body, in the athlete, in the muscle of the athlete during different exercise intensities, for example. And this is going to be the walkthrough here through those different metrics we're talking about. For today, I picked an example from cycling. This could be running, could be swimming, could be skiing, could be whatever. Okay, most of the case here, I start with cycling. So what you see on the x-axis here is intensity in terms of the power output. Again, this could be also running speed or power and running or whatsoever. And the dark blue line or the navy blue line represents the oxygen demand. So how much oxygen is needed, more simply you could say how much energy is needed for any power output on the x-axis, so to speak. So you can see as power output goes up linear, in cycling the gross efficiency is almost linear, therefore the energy demand or therefore oxygen demand goes up more or less linear. And then the light blue one is showing you, this is why we choose oxygen here as the unit, or as a metric. The light blue one shows you how much of this oxygen is basically covered by the aerobic metabolism. So how much of that is covered by VO2? And as you can see, as you would expect, at a relative low intensity, almost all the energy needed is covered by aerobic energy metabolism. Hence, the VO2, so the oxygen uptake, is almost the same, almost equals the oxygen demand. If you move to a higher intensity, so in this example, somewhere in the ballpark, north of 400 watts, you can see that this gap is opening up, this blue area is opening up. You can see there's a significant difference between the oxygen demand on the one side and how much, what is the supply, so to speak, or how much of that energy demand is covered aerobically. Right? And this is, again, how you would expect is that at a higher intensity, a significant portion of the energy or power is not covered by aerobic metabolism, but rather by glycolytic anaerobic metabolism. And this is what this chart shows you. And with training, this can change, because obviously what you're trying to do, you try to change the physiological profile of an athlete by training so that he or she puts out more watts, for example, or runs faster. So this changes by training, and also if you look at different athletes, it will look significantly different, right? So this gap is opening up at a lower or higher power output, and it's opening up more or less. So these are individual differences. The next thing we are looking at is lactate metabolism in terms of lactate production, represented by this red curve here, and lactate combustion. And if you look very closely, you will see that the lactate combustion curve has a similar shape as the oxygen uptake curve. You can see it's more or less linear, and then as higher output, it flattens a little bit. Going back here, you can see similar behavior. But that shouldn't be surprising, because instead of lactate combustion, you could say lactate oxidation, or you can say, instead of oxidizing lactate, you could say burning lactate. And at least in this universe, if you want to burn something, you need oxygen to do that. So it should be no surprise that the upper ceiling of burning something is defined by how much oxygen is there, right? It's the limiting factor. And this is basically what you see here. And because oxygen uptake is per minute, right? Make no mistake here, lactate production and combustion is also per minute. So it is a rate, right? This is not concentration what we're looking at. And because I sometimes hear, oh, it's kind of confusing, it's not what I see in a lactate concentration, a lactate profile test and a step test scenario. Yes, because it's concentration versus rate. I brought some stuff from the literature here. So for example, this is what you can find in the literature. You're not looking at pyruvate, but not at lactate, but at pyruvate, but yeah, we can dive into if there's a difference and why there's a small difference, so on and so forth. But again, it's a marker for glycolytic flux, and you can see these two bars, how they behave. And if you put the lines in there, you can see that the oxidation, so the combustion of pyruvate, is more or less linear, also in this study. And you can see that the formation, so the production, is curved linear, it's exponential. Again, that's exactly what you will find in INSCYD, because as you might have heard, INSCYD is only based on peer-reviewed and scientific literature. This is where all this comes from. So no surprise there. Okay, so going back to practical application, what does this chart tell us in terms of practical application, or how does it connect to the other metrics? I already mentioned the lactate combustion rate is linked to the oxygen uptake, right? For reason explained. And again, that's also known. I put another one here from, so to speak, the guru of lactate metabolism, George Brooks, who found that lactate oxidation is almost a linear function of VO2 up to intensity of approximately 75% of VO2 max. But no surprise, where is anaerobic threshold? Max lactate steady state approximately in average, in an average population, 75% of VO2 max. So again, this is what we see. What's interesting now is to look at the intensity at which the production matches the combustion. So we can say where it equals, where the formation or production of lactate equals the ability or the maximum ability to combust lactate. And zoom in here and you see this, this power output. Well, and if you go to, you can look left, so to speak, of this point, which you can see that the possible combustion is always higher than the production. And you could look right at that point at a higher power output where combustion is lower than production. Production exceeds combustion. And what would happen if the production of lactate exceeds the possible combustion? Of course, lactate would accumulate. So what you're looking at here, at this red circle, is actually the equilibrium of lactate production and combustion. And it's the highest equilibrium because, as you can see here, the higher power output, it's more lactate produced and combusted. So that means that this red circle is actually the physiological explanation for your maximum lactate steady state or anaerobic threshold, or nowadays, especially in cycling, called FTP. So this is what it is. This is where it comes from, right? Another important way to look at this graph is look at the gap. Look at the gap, how much difference there is between lactate production and combustion. Because what I would like you to do, I would like you to view lactate as what it is, a fuel, right? As you are listening here and while I'm talking here, for example, our heart muscle is primarily running on lactate as a fuel, and lactate is a super fuel. So think about lactate as a fuel. So in the power output here in this example at 150 watts, the fuel demand or the possibility to burn fuel, so to speak, is 0.8 millimoles of lactate or lactate equivalents. And it's 0.35 that is delivered. So there is a gap. There's an amount of additional lactate that could potentially enter the metabolism at 150 watts. Okay? In this case, the delta of 0.45. And this is then plotted onto another graph, which you can basically see here. So the gray curve here, or both curves that you see here, are representing the difference, the delta between the combustion and production. You can say between the gross production and the gross combustion. Okay? So at this 150 watts, you can see the gap exactly 0.45. It goes to 0 at anaerobic threshold, right? Which is basically here. And then above threshold, this graph is telling you how quickly, how fast the athlete accumulates lactate. And from a practical perspective, or from some experience, which I would like to share here, I can tell you that this graph has been, when I was coaching professional cycling teams, this graph has been one of the maybe most important ones that we looked at when we wanted to make an informed decision on the performance of the performance status of a rider, because it tells us the ability, how quick can a rider recover, which is important in road cycling. It tells us something about anaerobic threshold, which is not really important in road cycling, but it is such a common KPI. And it tells us something about how quickly lactate accumulates, which is obviously important because the race is won always above threshold, and the slower lactate accumulates above threshold, the better. Another part of the metabolic profile is looking at the substrate utilization, looking at how much of the energy, before we look, so to speak, at aerobic and anaerobic. Now we are looking at how much of that energy is coming from fat versus carbohydrates. Okay? And in the graph here, you can see we've marked this fat max zone, so the apex of the green curve, which is only displayed in kilocalories per hour, as the so-called fat max zone, and then the carbohydrate is also represented on the right y-axis in grams per hour, just because it's easier. You can take a look on your energy bar or jail and read, okay, that's approximately 20, 25 grams-ish. And it's just more practical, so to speak. And the common, so to speak, range of possible carbohydrate uptake, 60 to 90 grams, is marked orange here, or light red. Yes, and of course you can play around with more than that. It might be a possibility, but still 60 to 90 is kind of the most common one. So that's the profile. This is how the data is interconnected. So now, after we define what the profile is, and I kind of introduce the metrics, introduce the parameters, now we come to the most important topic of today, maybe how to utilize that. And one thing that we can do, utilizing or leveraging this data, is basically we can create much more individual training zones. Okay, and And let's look at those training zones and why it is important to have individual training zones. And I could not resist to start with what is normally done. So normally, if you use generic training zones, the most common thing is base generic zones on threshold values, a certain percentage of threshold. Okay. So let's give one example, looking at two different athletes. Apologies for everybody who works in running and triathlons, that this is another cycling example. I will have more running examples as well. So let's have an example here about cycling. Two different type of athletes. That is the story here. Two different type of athletes. So one is more, in terms of running, it would be more like a marathon guy, right? Low VLA max, low anaerobic capacity, low glycolytic power. That's the guy on the left-hand side. High VO2 max, so on and so forth. And the guy on the right-hand side, the sprinter type, has a tiny bit lower VO2 max, but that's not the point. The point is he is anaerobically much, much stronger. Okay, so two different athletes. One is anaerobically speaking stronger, which is obviously the sprinter. Now, this is why it's not such a nice example. It's easy to compare because of the difference in body weight. They show the same anaerobic threshold, AT or FTP, we want to say. Okay. So anaerobic threshold / FTP, both the same for both guys. So what happens if we take those two riders and have generic training zones? Okay, and let me give you an example. Let's say we take a generic training zone based on FTP. The problem that is going to happen is that the low glycolytic guy, the non-sprinter type, the endurance type of rider, so to speak, has a higher fraction of his VO2 max that he's utilizing at threshold. So basically, his anaerobic threshold is relatively close to his VO2 max. Whereas a sprinter, it's different. The sprinter is using a smaller fraction of his VO2 max at anaerobic threshold. So it's no rocket science to already see in this picture that if you set up a training based on percentage of anaerobic threshold, the training stimulus on VO2 max on the aerobic system, which is most likely what you want to train here in endurance sports, is different. Let me show you. So this example, both athletes riding at an intensity which equals 100% of the AT or FTP. So both riding at threshold, 75 watts. And what you're looking at here is a percentage, how much they are utilizing the aerobic system, how much they're utilizing their VO2 max, and how much they're utilizing their glycolytic system, their VLA max. And why is it important to look at that? Well, think about it. How in all sports and in all scientific literature is the training intensity described as a percentage of maximum, right? You go to the gym, you want to do squatting, you want to define how many weights you put on the bar when you do, squatting, and what you're going to do, you're looking at the one repetition maximum, right? And then you take a percentage of that. You look at any scientific paper talking about the effect, how efficient different training programs are, and you're always going to look at percentage of VO2 max, right? So this is where all the knowledge comes from, and which, where you can differentiate how a training program works. Now, in contrast to that, if you base your training zones on anaerobic threshold, as you can see here, both athletes riding an anaerobic threshold, the sprinter type, so the one with the actually lower VO2 max, has also a lower stimulus. He only rides at 62% of his VO2 max, while the low glycolytic or the low anaerobic guy rides at a much higher percentage, right? In contrast to that, the stimulus on his glycolytic system for the sprinter is relatively low, and for the low anaerobic guy, it is 3 times higher. We come back to that. We come back to talking about the stimulus, the training stimulus by interval training, for example, on these systems. So maybe this is not what you want, right? And for sure, this is not what you see when you just base training intensity on threshold, right? Because it's 3 times higher training stimulus on the anaerobic system maybe not what you want for a marathon type of guy. Now, in contrast, this is 40-20 kind of, so 40 seconds on, 20 seconds off interval. And in contrast to basing the intensity on anaerobic threshold, in this case, it is based on 100% of VO2 max. And you can see in the brackets now the power output is vastly different, right? It's approximately 100 watts difference in power output because of, in this case, the athletes have different body weight, right? And now you can see, now if you base these intervals on a percentage of VO2 max, the training stimulus on the aerobic system becomes very similar, right? So it's much more precise if you want to take it this way, right? So that's obviously the much better way to do it. Or in other words, to summarize what I wanted to use as an example for is, you should eventually base the training intensity on the metrics that you want to train, right? If you go to the gym and you want to improve the strength of your quadriceps muscle on your leg muscle, you're prescribing the percentage of the 1 repetition maximum based on the 1 repetition maximum in squatting and not in bench press. Because you understand you're training different muscles. And it's very similar here. If you're interested in increasing VO2 max, well, of course you should base the training intensity based on VO2 max. If you're interested in increasing fat max, something we want to look at here, then maybe it's not a bad idea to base training intensity on fat max, for example, as an example. Okay? So this brings me to the training zones. And for everybody who's using INSCYD, spoiler alert, you're going to see a massive update in training zones within the next months approximately. You can define your own training zones in much more customized way. But let's look at what we're doing at the moment. At the moment, all these training zones that you see here, base, medial, fat max, threshold, aerobic maximum, high anaerobic, lactate shuttling, all these are not based on just a percentage on any number. It's not that all zones are based on the percentage of threshold or VO2 max whatsoever. No, each zone is defined by its own what we call a master metric. So base training is calculated based on substrate utilization, right? Because when you do long hours, many hours low intensity training, it's a fueling issue, right? Fat max, obviously, based on the individual fat max intensity of an athlete. Anaerobic threshold, of course, based on anaerobic threshold. Aerobic maximum, based on VO2 max, right? Because this is what it is. This is what you're trying to train. High anaerobic training intensity or zone based on how much energy is covered by anaerobic metabolism. So again, based on the master metric, so to speak. Now I would like to talk about the example of fat max. So I picked a couple of examples for today's webinar, and one is fat max. Why fat max? Well, obviously because it's very popular. So how can we utilize or not utilize fat max zone? Let me give you a few examples how you can utilize information that we looked at in the metabolic profile of lactate production, of carbohydrate combustion, of fat combustion, lactate recovery, and so on. How do we leverage that information to make better training programs? Example number 1, fat max. Here's again what we're looking at, the graphs that we talked about before, part of the metabolic profile. Okay? Fat max zone. In this case, in this example here, you can read from the x-axis somewhere in the ballpark of 130, 140 to 160 watts, right? So there's this plateau in the middle range, of course. And of course, different athletes have different fat max intensity, right? It can be lower, it can be higher. Some of you will be familiar with the great work of Asper Jolkendorf, where you can see that he also shows that fat max, so how high it is, how much kilocalories are coming from fat at fat max, and at which intensity it is is highly different from one athlete to another, and it's different between male and female, and so on. So fat max zone is highly individual. Therefore, you cannot come up with a generic number, but you need to test, you need to assess it in the athlete. Okay. So why or why not train or use this fat max zone? What are the benefits? So let's discuss it a little bit step by step here. So on the pro side, the con is theoretically, you get the greatest training stimulus for improving enzyme activity involved in beta oxidation. Let me explain what I mean with that. Beta oxidation is basically fat combustion, simplified speaking. Okay? And in general, the idea of training is when you utilize a system, when you use a system of training, it's a stimulus, right? You're using it, and therefore it is improving. So when you write at fat max, think about it this way: you have the highest processing rate going on in all these enzymes which are involved in fat combustion, right? Because at a lower intensity, let's go back here, if you see the left or right of this apex, there's less fat combustion, therefore there's less activity of burning fat, right? There's less activity in the enzymes when I take it this way, okay? So therefore, if you believe in the principle that you utilize the system and therefore it's get better, right? I go into the weight room and I do some arm curls and therefore my biceps gets bigger, and if I stop doing it, it gets smaller. That's the idea of training. So for this very reason, it should have a positive effect on the fat combustion itself. Maybe the more important one is the second bullet point here. The maximum, it is a maximum of additional oxygen uptake and therefore should provide superior aerobic adaptation. What I mean is that the beta oxidation, the fat combustion, needs additional oxygen over just burning carbohydrates. Everybody of you who owns a performance lab or has done a test being attached to a metabolic cart knows that using the RER, the ratio between CO2 and VO2, to determine what is approximately the fat combustion. What it basically is, it's looking at additional oxygen, which is needed to prepare fat so that we can use fat as a fuel. So at fat max, basically, the muscle has the maximum of this additional oxygen. Right? So it needs more oxygen, not for muscle contraction, not for producing ATP for power, but for producing energy just to prepare the fat to get burned. And if you look at, for example, the effects, the theoretical or proven effects of training on lower carbohydrates, utilizing more fat, it's the same principle. It is the same principle why low carb training or reduced carb training showed better, at least transcription, or I don't want to go on too deep here, but better trigger for aerobic adaptation is because you're running at higher VO2, right? For the same given power, because of the additional oxygen needed, you need more VO2. So it should be, based on everything that's outside in the literature, it should be a superior stimulus to your aerobic system. Why should you not do that? Or what to take into account when you look at fat max zone? Make no mistake here, the fat max zone is not the universal intensity for long endurance sessions. It can be in some athletes, but for example, if you look at professional endurance athletes, the fat max zone is at a very high power output, at a very high running speed. If you look into a professional triathlete, marathon runner, cyclist, fat max zone is way above the intensity that people will be able to sustain for long endurance sessions, especially in cyclists because they train so many hours, right? Give you one example, fat max zone of a 75 kilogram athlete in cycling is north of 300 watts, 300, 310, 320. Base training for this athlete is more in the ballpark of 230, 240 watts. The race Paleo B, which is one of the hardest races out there, is 6 hours at this intensity in average. So to put this in perspective, it's way too hard. And this is referring to the second bullet point here. This is because the carbohydrate combustion at fat max can be significant. It can be significant high. It can be way too high for a long endurance training. This is what we're going to talk about. Okay? If carbohydrates are not the limiting factor, then fat max could be indeed be the superior intensity for your base training. But the limiting factor, the bottleneck, is not the fat max. Right? It's maybe the desired intensity, but how close you are able to ride at this. So maybe you aim for fat max, but if you're able to ride at fat max or just at 90% of it, is decided by the carbohydrate combustion. And this is what we're going to look at now. Okay? So a little bit more precise, a little bit more going to the practical application. How do we choose the right intensity for this endurance training? When I say endurance training, from precise definition, maybe let's say it's a long, slow distance training, okay? How do we decide on that? And what you need to keep in mind is glycogen stores. You have glycogen content measured in your INSCYD, so you know how much glycogen is there. What you need to keep in mind is here that it takes a minimum of 48 hours to replenish muscle glycogen. And 48 hours applies for 70% of carbohydrates in the diet. And this is not 70% of the weight, this is 70% of the energy coming from carbohydrates. And to put this in perspective, muesli with nuts and raisins has approximately 70% carbohydrates. This is out adding milk or something. So what I'm trying to say here is 70% carbohydrate content is pretty difficult to reach, and therefore it's even more than 48 hours. This is what you see in this graph, how the glycogen content in the muscle changes over the course of several days. When you have a high carbohydrate diet and you have a low carbohydrate, it's training every day, every 24 hours, and you can see even this high carbohydrate diet, you're step by step going down to a lower glycogen content, okay? And that is important when you plan the training. Okay, so how do we plan the training now with that information? Let's make an example of a cyclist, again, a runner coming afterwards. And this is, so to speak, the empty template of what your athlete is telling you, how much time he or she has. He says, okay, during weekdays, I have maximum 1 hour, and then maybe I can maximum train 4 hours during the weekend. How would you plan the training then? Well, let me give one example. You can say Monday is 1 hour, it's intervals. Therefore, Tuesday I do a day off, Wednesday I do another easy ride, Thursday I have another day off, and then Friday is another day of intervals. And then I want to use Saturday and Sunday for some longer climbing session. Is this a good way to do it? Potentially you could do it. Depends on the intensity. So for sure the athlete could do 4 hours Saturday and Sunday and Monday intervals, but depends on the intensity. And you need to keep in mind that he needs energy for those intervals. And this is what I mean when I say start at the end. You want to think this backwards. So in this case, you want to think about the Monday, for an example, and then go backwards and understand, okay, how hard can this guy train on Sunday in order to be able to do his intervals on Monday? And how hard can he train on Saturday in order to do this climbing on Sunday, and so on and so forth, okay? So maybe that's not the best way to do it, with intervals after climbing. Maybe a better way to do it is to have Monday easy day most obviously. But then still, you're doing the same thing. You're doing it backwards. So in this case, you can see Sunday now is not climbing, but it's riding flat, trying to, trying to say here basically the average intensity is lower. Saturday is, so to speak, more like the mid intensity, and Friday is the highest intensity. Why is that? Friday is coming after a rest day. So Thursday, remember this graph, how the glycogen content behaves? Thursday would be a nice day to replenish, right? You can expect after Tuesday being off, Wednesday being easy, Thursday being off, the athlete is fully stored with glycogen when he hits the training session on Friday. And because intervals implies that it's hard, therefore it's a high carbohydrate flux rate, it's many carbohydrates needed, you need the athlete to be glycogen replenished, okay? And now you could add some information how you would want to fuel the athlete. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, nothing specifically needed in terms of fueling, because there's not so many hours of training. And additionally, you have many days off. So substituting carbohydrates is not going to be a bottleneck here, right? However, because you have the climbing intensity, the climbing on Saturday, you want to make sure that the athlete maybe substitutes carbohydrates in his interval training, and he wants to maybe have high carbohydrate meals to be ready for the climbing on Saturday. Okay. Now on Saturday, you want maybe also to substitute carbohydrates during the training so that the athlete doesn't run low or bonk, right? But then you can see I kept out the high carbohydrate meals. Why is that? Because yeah, for a flat ride on Sunday, you not necessarily need it, right? Because basically the intensity of the Sunday ride, and that's what I'm going to show you next year, is potentially so low that the athlete could fuel in time, right? What do I mean with that? The dark black arrow here represents, for example, could be the intensity for the Friday intervals. And you can read from the carbohydrate curve at 240 watts with that athlete. The carbohydrate combustion is approximately 240-ish grams per hour. So no way the athlete can substitute the carbohydrates while riding. It's impossible, right? The combustion rate is so much higher than what the athlete can take in, even if he tries super hard, okay? So therefore, maybe substitute during the training, but for sure, because basically you will lower the glycogen content. Therefore, the idea, going back, to have high carbohydrate meals in the evening. On Saturday, now the intensity might be a little bit, or it's going to be a little bit different. The climbing is maybe happening a little bit below anaerobic threshold. Anaerobic threshold, you can see here in this image, in this graph, their fat combustion runs to 0. So somewhere in the ballpark of 230 watts. Okay, so the climbing is maybe just a little bit below. So it is still, you know, an intensity where carbohydrate combustion is at 130 grams, but of course he's not climbing consecutive for hours, right? There's some downhills and fat training and so on in between, right? So you want to substitute during the effort to ensure fueling is good enough to do these kind of training. And then for the Sunday ride, yes, for the Sunday ride, this athlete can ride at fat max. Because you can see at fat max, the carbohydrate combustion rate is 60 grams per hour, right? And this, of course, is going to be possible to fuel during the training if needed, right? So basically, even if the athlete starts with comparable lower glycogen and maybe is in the danger, so to speak, of bonk, the intensity is so low that he can always, you know, refuel during the training. Okay, so that's kind of the idea here. I hope this came across. The idea is start from the back, right, going backwards. Think about the fueling that is needed, and then you decide on the intensity. Let me give you another example. Let's just imagine this athlete here would be in a training camp, and he would ride maybe every day 4 to 5 hours with some climbs. Would you in this case still choose the same power output for you know, the endurance and the aerobic? Would you still stick with 150 watts? Maybe not. Because from day to day, just as we've seen in this glycogen chart, the athlete might, you know, dig a hole for him, so to speak, or for her, right? Because, yeah, 60 grams, yeah, it's possible, but with the climbing on top of that, maybe it's too much. So for a scenario like this, you would choose a training intensity, which is maybe slightly lower, and look at the graphs at 10, 20 watts lower, 140, 130 watts. You can see the fat combustion almost doesn't change. So you still get almost the maximum benefit when it comes to fat combustion, but at only 40 to 50 grams of carbohydrate combustion. Think about another example. Think about the athlete didn't ride on Saturday, so Saturday was off, and just rides on a Sunday. And Monday is also off, or just easy. Well, then go to the other side, to the right side of the apex of the fat combustion curve. Go to 160, 170 watts. Yes, the carbohydrate combustion is much, much higher, right? But the training intensity, total energy, the total stimulus is higher. Fat combustion is almost maximum. And the carbohydrate combustion being higher is not a problem because it's, it's coming after rest day, and it's a rest day that follows. Okay, so training intensity here isn't such a fixed thing in terms for this base training, but you can move left and right. You can be a little more flexible offset fat max curve. Okay. Again, just a gentle reminder. If you have questions, please put it in the Q&A and not personal. That's easier to manage for me to answer them. Let's have an example from running. And I picked one that there have been some discussions about with users. This is training zones from a recreational athlete. Training zones from a recreational athlete. And you can see that, for example, the base training is at approximately 2 meters per second, which is 8 minutes 20 per kilometer. And you go, wow, that's hardly running, right? That's hardly running. It's almost impossible, not to speak very demotivating for the athlete to tell him or her to run at 8 minutes 20 per kilometer. But matter of fact is, base training here is maybe not the best intensity to go training for this runner, because it's, think about it, it's a recreational runner. How much does a recreational runner train? Here are the two zones. The base zone, per definition. What do I mean by definition? Base training zone, if you look into the textbooks, it's somewhere happening at a lactate concentration of 1.5, maximum 2, right? So per definition, if you look at the lactate concentration, you can see this is this crossing point where fat combustion, in this case, matches carbohydrate combustion. So this is per definition base zone, 2 meters per second, 8 minutes 20 per kilometer. But the more practical zone for a recreational runner who runs 3 to 4 times per week is much, much higher. And you can see this is far off fat max, and this is at a carbohydrate combustion rate, which is much, much higher. So now, is that a problem? Or can we do this? Can we train there? Well, you maybe should train there, because refueling, filling up your glycogen is not an issue. Because it's a recreational runner, it's not a cyclist who trains 4 hours per day. So here's an example training program. For example, this guy could maybe run Tuesday 45 minutes, Thursday 45 minutes, Saturday a little bit, and then maybe one day, maybe Sunday in this example, do one longer run. Yes, and then maybe you want to refuel a little bit for this longer run. And this longer run on Sunday, yes, can be at lower intensity, right? Can be somewhere between maybe the red and the blue one, or a little bit left of the blue one, so for example. But for the other days, for the 45-minute sessions, no need to go to, the per definition 1.5 millimoles fat max zone, right? Have him or her run at a higher intensity, train at a higher intensity, why not? So let me summarize the checklist, how to define training intensities for longer trainings. One thing is, check the approximately carbohydrate combustion in that session you are planning for. Think about how much carbohydrate is needed, total and or per hour, and is the athlete able, in a worst case scenario, if he or she runs slow, is the athlete able to replenish that, right? So you need to look at what is the combustion rate. If it exceeds 60, 70, 80 grams, it's unlikely really that the athlete is replenishing that. I mean, think about 75 grams, that's 3 joules per hour for 4 hours. Realistically speaking, yes, theoretically it's possible. Realistically speaking, who of your athletes is going to take on a 4-hour ride 12 energy joules? Not very likely. Okay, so check for that criteria. Point 2, Check when it's the next session at which high carbo or high lipid combustion rate is needed. So basically saying when is the next session where the intensity is higher. If it's the next day, then you need to drop the intensity of that very day you're planning, right? If there's a day of rest in between, no problem to go on the right part of the apex of the fat max curve. This always leads to the point that you want to start advise your athlete on fueling or meals. And when I say that, I don't mean that you need to write a nutrition program. I'm just talking about, just as we said, fueling in the session, yes or no. And the meals, take care or watch, ensure that you have high carbohydrates, yes or no. You don't have to count the grams here or weigh your meals or something. That's not what I'm talking about. Okay, and then for the reason that fat max zone should be or would be the most efficient in terms of aerobic training stimulus, based on these metrics, these limitations before, choose an intensity which is as close to fat max as possible. Okay, and what it means, and the result, is that as a result of those rules, the best intensity for long endurance training might differ a little bit. So it is not always going to be 180 watts, right? As I said, in a training camp scenario where you maybe train, for example, Saturday and Sunday, it should be a little bit lower. And if it's more like an isolated day, before and after easier, and at least afterwards the day is easy, then it can be a little bit higher. So there is a little bit of flexibility in that, again, going left and right of the apex of the fat max curve. Okay. So now, going to the second and therefore last example for today, which is interval training. So I picked these two examples here, long, slow distance training and high intense training, interval training. I'm not talking about the medium, so it's more like a polarized webinar if you want to say it this way. Looking at the low intensity stuff, looking at the high intensity. So interval training, how do we decide on the intensity and the duration for both the on and the off phase? So we have 4 parameters we're talking about. Intensity for the on phase, duration of the on phase, duration of the off phase for the recovery phase, and intensity of the off phase. Okay? So how do we tackle that? How do we approach that? One example, and sorry, I hate the name, but I picked it because I hope it resonates with many people, is VO2 max intervals. VO2 max intervals, what I mean is an interval which people choose because either they think it increases VO2 max or they're writing at VO2 max. I'm never sure what is actually the name intends to say, but I'm talking about intervals who last several minutes, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever minutes, okay? So how do we choose the intensity of those intervals? Of course, the intensity is a function of the duration and vice versa. If you want to have longer intervals, you need to go less in the intensity. If you want to go shorter, you can go higher in intensity. But something that is often overlooked, and this is why I struggle so much with the name VO2 max intervals, is that basically any intensity above critical power maximum lactate steady state, FTP, whatever you want to call that zone, any intensity above that will lead to VO2 max sooner or later. Let me say that again. What you see here is any point, you can look at the power duration curve or whatsoever, it doesn't really matter. Any intensity which is above anaerobic threshold, maximum lactate steady state critical power, will elicit VO2 max. The higher the intensity, the sooner. As you can see on the dotted line on the left, at approximately 4 minutes, is a higher intensity, and it reaches VO2 max sooner. In this case, this is 370 watts. The black triangle is 320 watts, much lower, 50 watts lower. Athlete is riding approximately 10 or 11 minutes. I'm talking about the dashed line on the far right, right? Athlete is riding not 4 minutes, but 10 or 11 minutes, but is also riding at VO2 max. Okay? And that is something we need to find some common ground on here, is that any intensity above critical power max, like this is eliciting VO2 max. So this is why I struggle a little bit with what is meant as VO2 max, because 3 minutes as well as 6 minutes are going to elicit VO2 max. So how do we choose now if we want to ride, or we want to prescribe a training which is 4 minutes, or let's say 8 minutes? How do you know that? How do you know that when you know that in both scenarios, the athlete will arrive at VO2 max? How do you decide which one it is? And a good decision maker here is that one. Because most likely, you will not only have a training goal with VO2 max, you will not only think, oh, I want to increase the VO2 max with my athlete. Most likely, you will also care about what happens to the VLA max of the athlete. Okay? And this is what this is about. So this is the yellow area here. The yellow area here is everything that is above threshold. Right? You can see this crossing point between red and blue, anaerobic threshold. So the yellow area here is telling you all the intensities that are eliciting VO2 max. Right? In this case, it's, let's say, something above 350 watts. Everything above 350 watts, sooner or later, will result in VO2 max, we can show you. So which one do you choose? You have this whole range. And what you want to look at, you want to look at the lactate production here. Because think about it, what we said is, if you use a system, it becomes stronger. I had an example with my biceps, right? I do some arm curls and hopefully getting a bigger arm because I use it. So when you're utilizing your lactate production, saying when you're utilizing your glycolytic system, there's a chance that your VLMX goes up. And maybe you want that. Maybe you don't want that. So you have this range. I make up 2 cases here, just as an example. Don't look at the precise power output, just as an example. Case A and case B. If you want to have the low training stimulus on your VLMX, to not have a positive adaptation, not have an increased VLMX, then you most likely would not apply a training intensity where VLMX is triggered to a high amount, to a big amount. So you would go to A. You know what I'm saying is, you want VO2 max. You want, in this example, you want to ride at VO2 max, but you're riding VO2 max anyway. No matter if you ride at 370 watts or 500 watts. The question is only how long does it take to ride at VO2 max. So now we are talking about the difference. How do I decide riding at 380 or at 500? Well, at 380 watts, the trigger, the training stimulus on your glycolytic system is much, much lower than it is at 500 watts, obviously. Okay? Now, at 500 watts, you also go to VO2 max, but the stimulus on the VLA max is higher. So if that's what you want, if you want to improve VLA max and not have it being lower, then maybe the example B is better. And if you are like, oh, well, no, better not try to elevate it, then example A is most likely better. Okay? So this is how you decide the intensity for the on phase, A or B. You need to choose where you want to be. You want a higher stimulus on VLA max or lower one? Okay, and this brings us now to how do we go about the recovery and the duration. Okay, let me give you 2 examples here with A and B. So this is going from the lactate production to the actual accumulation. So start with example A. You can read now what is the accumulation rate at this intensity. So intensity here I think is 380 watts in case A and 460 in case B. So the accumulation rate in case A is 0.6. In case B is 3.5. We're talking about millimoles per minute. Okay, so let's come up with an example. Example A, 0.6. It's just a little bit above threshold, right? Remember, threshold was 350 watts. Now this is 380. So it's just a little bit higher. So in example, let's choose 8 minutes. In this 8 minutes multiplied by 0.6 millimoles per minute, you will arrive at 4.8 millimoles above baseline. Okay? So this is example A. Example B, let's say you write there for 3 minutes. The athlete will, after 3 minutes, 3 multiplied by 3.5, the athlete will arrive at 10.5 millimoles, again, above baseline. Baseline, so resting lactate, or whatever it was before, 1.5, 2, whatsoever. So the athlete will arrive at 10.5. Okay. So what is noted, there's one restriction. All these charts are only referring to like the carbohydrate and stuff. It's only referring to the muscle work. It's not total body carbohydrate. But more important, everything is referring to steady state conditions. And the further away you are from steady state conditions, the less accurate, so to speak, it gets. And steady state conditions, best way to look at it is steady state conditions in terms of VO2 steady state. So VO2 steady state, you get close to VO2 steady state within approximately 90 seconds. It's a highly trained athlete, it's a bit less. It's a less trained athlete, maybe 2 minutes. So basically saying, takeaway message, if your interval is much shorter than 2 minutes, this calculation we just did gets less accurate, just so that you're aware. So, okay, now let's go to the off phase. Maximum possible lactate combustion rate in this athlete is 0.8 at a power output of 240 watts approximately. So let's back calculate now for the A example. Lactate will go baseline 4.8. If we want to get rid of that, that is 4.8 divided by 0.8 millimoles per minute, which therefore results in 6 minutes recovery time. For athlete B, or for example B, lactate will go baseline by 10.5. If we divide 10.5 by 0.8, it's approximately 30 minutes. Okay, for recovery. Now, wait a second. This is a good approximation, but there have been some questions or some misconceptions about this concept. Think about it. If your combustion rate would be static at 0.8, 10.5, where would it stop? So why would, arriving at 2 millimoles or 1.5, why would the 0.8 stop? I mean, you're talking about physiology, you're talking biology. It's not like combustion rate is absolutely 0.8 all the time, and just when you arrive back at 1.5, it all of a sudden stops. That's obviously not the case. It is a little bit different than that. So what you're looking at here is the maximum combustion rate possible. And it is very helpful, very practical, very useful to use that to calculate the intensity and also the approximate time for combustion. But to disclose the full picture here, the real concentration, for example A and example B, will look a little bit different. Because basically when you already arrive at a low lactate concentration, the recovery rate, so to speak, the rate at which the lactate disappear gets slower. You can see this here for case A and case B, example A and example B. I choose 1.5 resting millimoles. This is why it's not 4.8, but a little bit above 6, and why it's not 10.5, but 12 at time 0. You can see that it's almost linear in the beginning. And once you go on the ballpark of approximately 3 millimoles, some athletes more like 3.5, and some athletes more like 2.5, whatever. But when you come down to this number, the recovery gets much slower. Okay? So just that you are aware. Okay, so this 0.8 example is valid until you are close to baseline. But going back entirely back to baseline takes a little bit more time. Okay, so that is noted here that the combustion rate that we're looking at, the 0.8, the maximum level of pyruvate, is is valid, is useful to calculate the recovery time down to electric concentration approximately in the ballpark of 3. Okay. Almost done. Last one. What you need to be aware of is that those accumulation rates and also these recovery rates can vastly differ significantly from one athlete to another. And this is true also for athletes who do have a significant different, athletes who have exactly the same anaerobic threshold power. You can see it here. This is electric accumulation, solid line, dashed lines. This is 2 athletes. It goes to 0 at the same power output. So they both have the same threshold, FTP, max lactate steady state, right? But they both have a significant different metabolic profile. Lower VO2 max, lower VLA max in case of rider A, 1, and higher VO2 max, higher VLA max in case of rider 2. And if you just look at it, it might not appear to be this big, right? We're talking about 0.5, 0.6 millimoles per minute. I remember a coach 2 years ago from the US who had an athlete who were racing significantly better, but there were only mild changes. And the electric accumulation rate was 0.2 millimoles per minute less. So do the math here. It's massive because you are multiplying the 0.2 with the time. Let me give you an example. Those 2 athletes both ride at 450 watts. The electric accumulation rate of rider A, rider 1, is 2.6, and of rider 2 is 1.6. It's only 1 millimole difference. But if you're riding there for 5 minutes, the resulting lactate concentration is 13 versus 8. So, where I'm trying to go is look, watch out for that. Look for your athletes, how much they differ when you train them. That curve maybe is a little bit steeper, a little bit less steep. And keep in mind that those differences get amplified because they are multiplied with the duration. Riding at this intensity for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 50 minutes whatsoever, right? And therefore, the resulting lactate concentration is pretty tremendously different. Okay, and because this can change within 8 weeks to 4 months, the data that you have is only valid for a certain amount of time. So let me summarize. What did we talk about today? Sorry, it got a little bit longer. I said maybe an hour. So first is we talked about what do we understand when we say metabolic profile. And we talked about how these different metrics are connected, lactate production to combustion, and so on and so forth. And I showed a little bit where you find that, or this is in line with what you find in the literature. Then we talked about training zones, percentages of FTP, and if you use generic percentages, why it creates different training stimulus. And then we looked at substrate utilization and how substrate utilization can be used to define training intensities. And the benefits are that you can identify a fat max zone and therefore ride at an intensity where, or at which the VO2 uptake is maximized because you need additional O2 for the beta oxidation. That when you do this, you can avoid energy deficits because you look at the carbohydrate combustion, right? And that you allow for more individualized or periodized training because you periodize the intensity a little bit. And we talked about the intensity in the on phase for intervals. And that which intensity you choose might be not a decision only based on the VO2 max, but it might be a decision based on what you want to happen to the VLA max of the athlete. And we talked about that the duration and intensity for the off phase is ruled or is decided by the individual ability to recover, which is presented in this lactate recovery chart. And with that, thanks for staying on. A good hour. If you have more questions, I already had seen some great questions coming in here. If you have more questions, keep sending it now. If you want to learn more, if you have further questions, don't hesitate to send us an email, always, if you want, or schedule a call with somebody of us and learn more. Thanks for that, and I'm now going to start reading your questions and trying to answer as many of those as possible.